Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Greenleaf Book Group Building and Editing Your Book webinar. I think a lot of people have already signed in, and I think probably some people will be joining us in the next few minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started here. Just a reminder, you can chat us your questions or comments in the chat dialog box with your webinar window. Also, you can send us a tweet using our Twitter handle @GreenleafBookGR, and also include the hashtag #IdeasThrive in your tweet, assuming you have enough characters left to do so. We will be prompting you as we move through the slides for some spots where there are some specific tweets you could send us. So we do look forward to following your tweets and up with your chats as we move through the slides. So let's get going. Building and editing your book. This is me, and my name is Brandy Savarese, and you'll see as we move through the slides, there's even someone in this webinar who has a more difficult last name to pronounce than me. I'm an editor at Greenleaf Book Group. I've been here coming up on 2 years, and I work on everything from sort of leadership, executive, nonfiction, to home improvement books. My specialty is heavily illustrated coffee table books. So you can send us at Greenleaf any type of proposal you're after. We do just about everything, and we look forward to your ideas. Here's your prompt, tweet to win. One lucky webinar attendee today will receive a free consultation from Greenleaf, wherein an editor will give you constructive, critical, and useful feedback on your proposal or your manuscript. So tweet us to win at GreenleafBookGR, #IdeasThrive. What we'll cover today in the webinar, 3 points to know before you get started writing your book or your proposal, 3 guidelines for structuring your content, advice for how to sit down and actually get your words on the page, what to do when you have a first draft, and what is an editor and how do you find one. So, the 3 points you need to know before you start writing. These are critical. What's your message? Who's your audience? And what differentiates you from the market? You might think of market as the genre your book will be in, or look to other authors who are publishing sort of on the topics that you're looking to write on. Message. What is your book trying to say? Do you have an elevator pitch for your idea? Here's an opportunity for you to give it a try. Send us a tweet. If you can express your book's message in 140 characters, you're well on your way to constructing an elevator pitch. For your elevator pitch, you really want to think of the 3 to 5 supporting points for your book's message. So do you have 3 to 5 sentences that describe what your book is getting at in a concise and clear way? Really, if you can do that, you're pretty much golden. So send us your elevator pitches at Greenleaf Book Group. That's at Greenleaf Book GR, and we will. If you have any questions about your message, you can ask those in your chat box, and we'll try to answer those while we're working through the webinar. So here are a couple of examples of popular books that have unique messages, or at least give us sort of ideas to follow, examples to follow. This is David and Goliath, the first one by Malcolm Gladwell. This is Gladwell's most recent book. And Gladwell's elevator pitch is pretty simple. The way we think about advantages and disadvantages is all wrong. He's basically taking a sort of well-thought, commonly thought idea and turning it on its head. Gladwell's supporting points are many advantages can be disadvantages. Many disadvantages can also be advantages. And because of this duality, difficulty or experiencing difficulty is in many cases desirable. It can, experiencing difficulty can result in positive experiences. And the 4th point is, conversely, those who have power and advantage really must be aware of how they are vulnerable, despite that sort of power and advantage that they might have over others. So Gladwell's book here is a good example of simple elevator pitch and 4 points that support it. Then moving on to audience. Who's going to be interested in your message? So what we want to think about is your audience everyone? If you think your audience is everyone, you're probably casting too wide a net. Really and truly, not everyone's going to be interested in your book, and really not everyone can find an access point for your book. So you do want to try to narrow that audience from everyone to a specific segment of that market. Now, conversely, is your market or your audience too narrow? Are you looking into too much of a niche market that maybe can't support a release of your book into the marketplace? So we don't want to be too wide. We also don't want to be too narrow. And then do you have an aspirational audience? That's an audience that maybe you really weren't quite sure you would meet, but in some way your book spoke to an audience you didn't quite think of. So the audience for your own project. If you have, please let us know. Again, I'll give you that Twitter handle @GreenleafBookGR, #IdeasThrive. And we're going to move on and look at the audience for some titles. Here we have another Malcolm Gladwell title, Everyone Aspires to the Success of Malcolm Gladwell. So his projects are very useful for us to look at here. The primary audience for Gladwell's Blink project was social science readers. That's kind of general interest, and that's about as broad as you want to go. But Gladwell tapped into a secondary audience of readers. Those were business people and business leaders, and really found a great support in that part of the market. I don't know if the business people and leaders were an aspirational audience for Gladwell, but he certainly tapped into something they were all feeling at that moment. Now, an example of an audience that's more narrow, kind of perfectly narrow, is the Don't Freak Out Guide to Parenting with Kids with Asperger's. Fuente's primary audience here were parents of a child with Asperger's syndrome. So that's a pretty narrow, pretty niche market, though not so narrow that she was limiting herself. And she really did a better job here to spin her book narrowly than to write a general parenting book with a chapter on Asperger's. That chapter probably would have been lost, probably wouldn't have met as many parents out there who were really looking for a guide to help them with their specific parenting issue. So Fuentes did a pretty good job there of narrowing, but not too narrow. All right, take a little drink here. How do these points relate to fiction? That's a pretty great question. We had someone ask us how these points relate to fiction. I will tell you that this webinar or these slides probably are a little more geared toward a nonfiction writer. However, I do think these points can be very applicable to fiction writers. In fiction, you absolutely have to think about your audience. Are you looking for a sort of a well, let me give you an example. What pops into my mind is 50 Shades of Grey. And of course, when you're thinking about fiction, you can't help but think about a project like that was so successful. That project started out as fan fiction. The author had no intention of really hitting that kind of adult fiction, erotic fiction marketplace. She started out with fan fiction. She knew her market, and she wrote for it. She was very fortunate that, like Malcolm Gladwell, she tapped into sort of a zeitgeist of the moment and met that adult fiction market. So I do think it's very important for any fiction writer to consider who they're writing for. I think genre sort of speaks to that. Maybe you're a historical fiction writer. Are you writing westerns with a historical bent? Well, you need to think about your audience. How are they going to take to your, what would be the word, sort of glossing over some historical facts? Is it important to that audience that your history be intensely accurate? Or do you have some leeway to sort of play with facts? when you're writing a historical fiction. So definitely think about your market there. And our first point, I'm going to back up in the slides here and go back to message. Message, I think, is important for fiction in the regard that a book of fiction can't be sort of a never-ending trail of storytelling. There has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in that regard, I think it's very important for you to consider your message and to consider what you're trying to say. For the fiction writer, I think message can be better conceptualized as the path of your story and how it moves from beginning, middle, to end. And I do think we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through the slides. So I'm going to go back to market differentiation. Yeah. Okay, so market differentiation. And I do think this one applies to fiction as well as nonfiction. How is your book different than its competitors? This, I mean, really, I don't think anything could be more important in fiction, which is a flooded marketplace. There are countless fiction titles published every week. So you do really want to stand out. You want to identify what's different about your project and how that's going to make you stand out in the bookstore. Well, so what are you offering that's new? Do you have a great hook? Do you have a book of sci-fi that has some concepts that no one has ever written about? Are you a CEO who's put in place a leadership policy in their company that is absolutely different than any of your peers? So really consider, what is it about your project that's novel? What is it that's going to make someone say, I absolutely have to pick up this book? It's telling me something I've never seen before. What's going to help you do that is to do your market research. What's out there in your genre? What is just being published? And using Amazon, you can see what's going to come out in the next few months. So really, really do your legwork. Really go out there and see what's being published in the marketplace. Are you going to find a book that's really close to yours? You might. And if you do, you really should analyze closely how the market's going to accept that. Perhaps you're writing on a topic where many voices talking about similar ideas is acceptable. But maybe you're not. Maybe you're a CEO with a leadership concept that someone's already written about, or someone has written, or many people have written many projects on your concept. You might not want to go down that path and publish another book in that crowded marketplace. That's not going to serve your purposes. So then you can really think about your differentiation points of your project. Do you have a fresh metaphor? Are you offering exclusive research? Does your fiction narrative have an unusual tone or a new narrator? Do you have an unusual length? Are you offering a short handbook or guidebook to a leadership concept that maybe somebody who picks your project up in an airport doesn't want to look at 150 pages. Maybe they just want to read 75. Are you offering a narrower focus or more of a close look at an idea? Do you have a distinct author brand or platform? And we'll talk about platform in a little bit. Platform is very important and can really help authors reach a much broader market segment. And lastly, do you offer a provocative break from an accepted truth on a subject? Maybe you're just so novel out there that somebody interested in your genre is going to pick up that book because it's just not something they've ever heard before. So these are all examples of differentiation points. If you would like to share yours, we'd love to hear it. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but do tweet us at Greenleaf Book GR, #IdeasThrive, or feel free to send in your questions via the chat box. All right, great. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples because some of these concepts can be a little abstract. So here are 3 titles and their differentiators. Fearless Leadership is a title that was published in 2014 by Carrie Lorenz. Carrie Lorenz is a retired Air Force pilot. She offers leadership advice, so applicable to those leaders, CEOs, those in a business genre, but she's offering it from a military angle. So this is her fresh approach. This is her fresh voice. that she's using military lessons from an Air Force pilot to help leaders conceptualize new ways of dealing with their constituents. And so then also Carrie Lorenz differentiates herself even further in that within the military and or leadership genre, she's differentiated by her gender. We don't have a lot of these titles published, written by women, so she's really novel there in the fact that she's not only a woman offering leadership advice, but she's a woman retired military. So there's some ways that Carrie Lorenz has differentiated herself within a crowded leadership genre. Moving down the line, we have The Adventures of Johnny Bunko. This book appeals very much to the Gen X demographic who is desperate for career advice, but may not respond to a career book written in sort of straight prose, long chapters, how to. This is assembled with a graphic novel format. So really sort of capturing almost that Twitter aspect of communication, short chunks of information, illustrated, engaging, and relatable to that Gen X demographic. And then finally on the list we have The 5 Love Languages, which is relationship advice presented in a fresh and original framework. So really, how do you convey your love? How do you communicate your love to those in your life? And can you identify yourself in one of the 5 love languages? So I'm going to take a question here. How do you telegraph your point of differentiation to the book buyer? Cover, blurbs, and reviews. So we just had a great question. How do you telegraph your point of differentiation to the book buyer? Is it by cover, by blurbs, or by reviews? Well, I think, frankly, all of those things differentiate your or convey your differentiation point to your reader and the book buyer, but I do think what's critical is your message. So how are you conveying your message in terms of your cover copy, in terms of your table of contents, in terms of the description of your book in sales channels? We'll talk a little bit about table of contents in a few minutes, but I think you really have to look holistically at your package. We all do judge a book by its cover, so I think cover copy, the identities of those who do put blurbs on your jacket, and if there are reviewers, hopefully those reviewers are reiterating your point of differentiation and your message to book buyers who are reading the reviews. So thank you for that question. That's an excellent point. And it is kind of hokey, but it's very true. Covers speak volumes about what's going on inside your book. And it's very important that any person publishing a book, whether self-publishing, working with a traditional house, or working with a hybrid house, really considers a professional presentation in their book jacket. I would advise everyone to enlist a professional designer because that book cover is going to speak volumes and really differentiate you on the bookshelf. All right, so we're going to move on now to content structure. Thanks really everyone for your questions and your tweets. Again, just to remind you, we are giving away a consultation, so we would very much love to have your questions and or your ideas. You can tweet us at Greenleaf Book GR, #IdeasThrive, or you can chat us up in the dialogue window in your webinar. So content structure. We always start with an outline. Is making an outline fun? Not always. I'm not an outliner. I really don't enjoy the process, but some sort of outline for any project is necessary. So I would encourage each one of you to figure out which way do you like to outline. Do you want an intensely robust 5-page long, detailed to the minutia outline, or do you kind of want big bullet points, table of contents style outline to help you move through your writing process. Outlines are critical. They're very helpful, and as much as some of us may not like doing them, they can really get us to our end goal. Are you a hardcore outliner? Some people kind of get stuck outlining. So the pros of being a hardcore outliner are you have a really intense, really detailed map to follow when you're writing. The cons of being a hardcore outliner are it's a great way to procrastinate. Focusing on an outline creation that's 5-10 pages long really could take forever. So it's kind of a great way to feel like you're working on your project. Maybe you're not really working on your project. Or writing a very intense, very detailed outline might close off fruitful new paths in your writing, because if you have a pretty intense, pretty detailed outline and a new concept comes to you later on in the project, you might immediately dismiss it because it doesn't fit. So I would encourage you to be flexible. There's nothing wrong with creating that intense outline if that's what works for you, but I would say be open and allow room for things to change. So I would love to know if any of you out there have a unique method of organizing your content or sort of outlining how you're going to progress through your writing. So send that to us. I'm always interested in these new ideas. We have a question. So let's see. When writing a semi-autobiographical book, how to get around writing about a real person without pointing out the person, i.e. name, look, actual situation. So that's a great question and timely. I'm working on a project that is semi-autobiographical currently. And you can kind of get stuck in the description of that person and really not drive your project forward. But I think you don't want to avoid totally identifying that person. So I suppose my first question to the attendee who asked this question is, are you allowed to write about that person? Does that person know they're going to appear in your project? If they do and they're okay with it, then absolutely, by all means, describe them. Maybe you don't want to use their exact name, but I think there are some great elements that can be drawn from real life, and that is going to help your story. So if you can, go ahead and capitalize on those details. If you can't, then I think you're going to have to be very creative in obfuscating any detail that could specifically point to that person. So perhaps that person has blonde hair and blue eyes and is short. Well, maybe you can talk about the same person, but that person's going to have brown hair, brown eyes, and be quite tall. So think about creative ways in which you can obfuscate that identity, assuming you're not allowed to use it. So great question. Autobiographies and or memoirs can be complicated when you're trying to capture great stories, experiences that are very personal. So there is some real there's real narrative craft there, and I would encourage anyone working in that genre to really explore their creativity and try to avoid getting into the trap of just describing events or what has happened, strict descriptions of what has happened in the past. Be creative, really explore ways of narrative to help you move that type of project forward. Okay, great. So we're going to go back now to following the outline. You're going to want to, this is part of your outlining process, you're going to want to list your message and its supporting points. So this is pretty much how I outline. It's kind of high level, not super detailed. I'm going to write my message, that's my 3 to 5 sentence elevator pitch at the top of the page. And then I'm going to put bullet points of all the supporting details I can think of. And this is a place to kind of go crazy. List as many supporting points as you can think of. You're going to probably cross some out as you move forward. You might add some later. So I think it's very useful to cast a wide net here and try to come up with as many supporting points as you can. Then what you're going to do is you're going to list all of the stories and the narrative content you have that can support your supporting points. The stories in the narrative are really going to flesh out your ideas. They're going to add interest to your exposition. It's certainly not ideal to exclude personal stories and personal narrative from your project. Even if you're a CEO and you're writing a strict leadership how-to, use your own experiences and examples to add color to your ideas. And then what we'll want you to do is look back at your list. Which supporting points, those supporting points that bolster your message, which could be chapter headings? Are there any clear chapter titles or chapter ideas that emerge from that list? And then, is shape, rhythm, or hierarchy emerging from your list? Can you go back and reorganize each bullet point into a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 type order, such that you are thinking about how your points are going to move through a book and how they might create a table of contents? And from there, we're going to consider, how do you define the arc of your project? Defining the arc or the narrative arc is something that we often think of exclusively for fiction, but it is not true that a narrative arc is exclusive to fiction. In any project you're working on, you must lead your reader on a well-defined journey. This relates back to in the message and its supporting points. Is there a clear order to your supporting points that are going to help you flow and support your ideas through the narrative arc? Are you telling a story with exposition, rising action, climax, and denouement? So these are key aspects of the narrative arc that we want you to consider. As we spoke a little bit earlier in talking about fiction titles, it's very important to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think that's true fiction, nonfiction. So always think about how are you grasping the attention of your reader, drawing your reader through your story, and then concluding the story for them. And I'm pausing here to look at a question from a webinar attendee. Oh, this is a great question. You're probably not going to like my answer. When choosing a message for fiction, must it have a moral component or a societal message? I would say absolutely not. I like very much to read historical fiction. Historical fiction doesn't necessarily have an agenda, other than maybe to educate through a fictional story that is engaging. So I don't necessarily choose a fiction read for its moral component or its societal message. Now, with that said, I will say there are some tremendously successful recent fiction titles that do have a societal message and or moral component. I'm thinking of the Hunger Games series, which was unbelievably successful in young adult fiction, and I think a lot of adults also read it. And it had a pretty clear moral component and societal message. So I say if you can tap into that, and that's key to your story, by all means capture it. But I don't think it's absolutely critical. So hopefully that was a good answer. And maybe you wanted to hear me say no, it doesn't need a moral component or societal message. So thank you for that question. And back to your narrative arc. Do you have a content loop or content loops that bring your idea full circle? I worked on a project in a recent project about feedback in the workplace, and it was pretty fun to play with the idea of feedback loops and how we brought ideas full circle through the manuscript, and they sort of looped and looped and looped and looped. Hopefully they weren't too confusing for the readers, but I do think it's very important that you do bring your content full circle through your manuscript. This is especially true for nonfiction and instructional projects, self-help projects, leadership project. I think it's very critical that you close the loop for your reader. Readers often need their hands held. That's not a negative thing. They want you to be the expert and to establish your bona fides. So I think it's very important that you do hold their hand from start to finish. And you might feel like you're talking down to your reader, but I would venture to guess that you're not, that you're merely walking them down your path and showing them your wisdom and how that might help them. So more to defining the arc, I want you to look for great transitions. Do your supporting points lead into each other? So is there a hierarchical build? Does one lead to another, to another, to another? That's very important. Again, this is part of walking your reader down the path with you. So you very much want your supporting points to be linked together, and from there you'll build your narrative. And finally, does your arc serve your audience? So here, again, I'm going to go back to that idea of content loops. If you're being instructional, if you're giving how-to, if you're encouraging your readers to consider a new leadership concept, for example, you do really want that content loop to serve your audience, to give them the idea of how they are going to get on board with your idea, how they might implement that idea, and what is that going to do for them. So consider your audience and consider how they might interpret your narrative arc. In fiction, again, that's going to be carrying your reader from start to middle to finish. And I'm going to take another question here. This is a bit of a long one. I am writing a nonfiction book on a health topic that includes my own personal story, but also those of others I have interviewed for the book. In building the arc, I am wondering how the best way might be to weave in the survival stories of others with my own. I don't want to lose the messages of my own story or the messages of those I have interviewed. How do I close the loop? Okay, that's a great question. I think you can do a couple of things there. The first thing that pops into my mind is to utilize book design to really help you. In this case, what I might like to see, if there's not a clear trajectory from talking about your topic and your own personal story and linking it to those of the people you have interviewed, maybe you use some kind of text box or some kind of set apart text to offer your readers those stories, which are probably more concise than your own, in the regard that you can talk pretty lengthy about your own experience, but you might have discrete content pieces for these people you've interviewed. Maybe you can set them apart in a text box to offer them as supporting concepts, but without actually having to figure out how to integrate them. That's my best suggestion at this stage without seeing the manuscript and seeing perhaps how we might weave those stories together. But I do very much, for this type of project, this type of nonfiction project that captures experiences, I very much like to see book design used in that way to offer your reader a bit of a break. It breaks up the full page of prose, and it does kind of give readers different access points to different elements of your story. So at first glance, my answer is use creative book design. Without being able to really see the manuscript, I can't give you really a constructive, better answer than that. So hopefully that helps you, and maybe you'll win the maybe you might be the lucky person to win the consultation. So we will look forward to that drawing and to see what we get. Again, let me remind you, we are offering a free consultation for a webinar attendee. We would love to see your proposals, your ideas, your questions. You can either tweet us at Greenleaf Book GR, hashtag Ideas Thrive, or you can send us a chat in the dialog box in your webinar window. And thanks really to everyone who has sent us questions. These have been super questions, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to sort of break up the slides with real-world examples. So thanks so much. All right, so we're going to move on from defining your arc to balancing narrative and exposition. This is both relevant to nonfiction as much as it is to fiction, as it is to self-help, really any genre. I think it's critical that you balance narrative and exposition. Exposition is the description or explanation of your idea, your theory, or your plot. So this is a pretty kind of straightforward, kind of dry, maybe you think of exposition as your message. What are you trying to get at? Narrative is the storytelling and how you connect the events or the ideas throughout your book back to your message, back to your theory, back to your plot. So you're going to really want to balance those two if you have a concept that needs significant exposition. Perhaps you're, perhaps you have a very complicated how-to business title. The one on the feedback loop is what I'm thinking of from my recent experience. Each chapter had pretty significant exposition, telling you how to do what the author was describing or encouraging you to do. But it was very important that author also included stories and experiences in the narrative and created an experience in each chapter. So I think that's an ideal way to consider balancing exposition and narrative. Narrative, by definition, is storytelling and how you connect the events or ideas through your work. So can you add interest and engagement through your personal stories or experiences? And then I think it's important here to go back to your outline. Where in the outline do your personal stories fit? Do you have a story for each one of your chapters, for example? It would be, I think, very important to consider that if you want to expand on your idea in each chapter with a personal story, each chapter would need a personal story. If one chapter out of 5 didn't have that, your reader would sort of be left hanging. They would say, well, wait, you gave me these personal experiences and I was invested in your experience of your concept, but in chapter 5 you didn't give that to me. So I think it's important that you consider that those be balanced and that there be a one-to-one sort of equation, at least a one-to-one equation. And then this goes without saying, ideally exposition and narrative are woven together and balanced. We don't want a chapter where there's a conceptual definition at the beginning and then a story. They need to be woven together. They need to be connected and they need to be balanced. So think about each chapter as sort of a content loop. Do you take your reader through down a path from start, middle to end in each chapter? And does each chapter do that for each does each chapter do that for your manuscript as a whole? Okay, great. And then I want you to check for originality. This goes back to what we started with. Market differentiation is key. It's so important these days. So many people are publishing books. Really, it's kind of astounding how many books come out each week. So you do very much want to be aware of what's going on in your genre, aware of what's going on in that demographic who's going to be looking at your book, and really working toward keeping your market differentiation as unique as possible. And then ask yourself, does your outline follow similar paths to competitive titles? And here's an opportunity for you to dig in to what's out there in the marketplace and have a look at their outlines. How does an outline for a competitive title compare with your outline? I'm sorry, a table of contents for a competitive title compare with your own outline. So here, do your research, really dig in, really check out Amazon. You can often look at table of contents on the Amazon webpage. go to the bookstore, spend some time browsing. It's going to really pay off in the end. And then, does your book rely on long explanations of foundational concepts and topics your audience may already know? In this case, maybe you're writing in the business genre and you're talking about a concept that is just constantly referenced. Your readers probably know that. They probably are aware of those foundational concepts. They probably talk about those in their board meetings regularly. So you may not need to spend too much time actually really explaining that to them, reinventing the wheel. I would venture to guess that somebody reading in the business and leadership genre, for example, has probably read the foundational titles and doesn't need you to walk them through them again. So if you are spending some time on those foundational concepts, maybe you need to think of a new angle. Maybe you can check out a new way to kind of ground your exposition and narrative. And we're going to take another question. So here we have a question: is it okay to use some real names of individuals that I have interviewed and other experiences from clients and also use anonymous names, or should it be consistent? I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule there. I would encourage you to do your research on permissions. I think it's going to be very critical for you to have releases if you do want to use real names. Those people, any publisher will probably require that those people sign a release to have their name and their experience published in your book. Invariably, some people are going to say no. I would think that you could have a balance of both. At first blush, my response is it would be okay to have a mixture. Again, I think this is going to kind of depend on the manuscript and how these individuals are featured within your story. Maybe if we're using the text box example, maybe we would want every person featured in a text box to have a name, so that we weren't maybe calling attention to the fact that some either didn't sign releases or were unwilling to be featured in that way. So your editor might come up with a creative way to minimize the discrepancy or the difference between having some people who used their names and others who didn't. So my answer is kind of case by case, a little vague at this point, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to say probably okay to have both, especially if you have a creative editor. All right, so we're going to go back to talking about our outline here, outline length. Your basic starting point, the short outline, need only be a page or two long. It really doesn't need to be a 10-page super detailed outline. In fact, your 1 to 2 page outline may look like a table of contents, which is kind of ideal and a really terrific way to get started. So when you have that 2 to 3 page outline that sort of looks like a table of contents, maybe has parts, maybe has chapter titles, then you can flesh it out. And as I mentioned a little earlier, some people are really engaged in writing outlines. They really enjoy writing outlines. Some are not. So if you're not a really intense outliner, I think it's okay for you to continue with a 2, 3, maybe you add a page or two more outline, but it really doesn't have to be 10 to 20 pages long. And what I've done here is captured a couple of table of contents to show you a shorter, more high-level table of contents / outline, and a longer, very detailed table of contents / outline. So here we have the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. This would be one of those business books that I think most CEOs and leaders have read. It would be one of those that you really don't need to rehash for your readers if you're building on time management in the workplace, for example. But here what you see in Covey's table of contents, he has part titles, part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4. And then within that part, each part, he has chapters. Part one's really kind of a introductory part, really kind of setting the stage for his ideas. And then within part two, part three, and part four, he's itemizing each habit and really describing each habit for you. And then, of course, there's the end matter. Covey has two appendices, problem and opportunity index, and then his own index. So this is a pretty high level, pretty simple table of contents. I think this also functions very well as an outline. This would probably be what my outline would look like. I can see, and I think you out there in the webinar can probably see where supporting points fit in under each habit. You're going to have your supporting points. And then what Covey has done with his Appendix A and Appendix B, he's taken out some of those supporting points that may not fit within the habits, may not be quite descriptive enough, or may not be quite as high level enough to fit within his habits. And he's given you I think I'm looking at Appendix B, maybe it's a story of how he utilizes his 7 habits in the workplace. So that's a great model and a useful tool as well, those appendices. So I promised you a name that was more difficult to pronounce than my own, and here we have arrived, To Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. This is another project that has been very popular in terms of how one lives their life, how they might organize their ideas, their work, this sort of thing. And you can see how flow here in the table of contents is intensely detailed. There are countless supporting points under each chapter heading. He has 10 chapters. I can imagine his notes and references section are quite robust. And then within each chapter there are numerous divisions of the narrative. So this would be how a very long, very robust outline might translate into a more complex, more detailed table of contents. Nonetheless, I think it's a great example of how you might itemize your material as you're working through complex ideas and narratives. So we're going to now get to the writing process. I think we are maybe a little more than halfway done. Are we doing well on time? Yes. Do we have a new question? We do. I'm going to pause for a question here. Thank you guys so much for sending in your questions. The question, I'm writing my memoir. Many events in my life happened in small towns, and they were not positive events. I don't want my experiences to point to the people involved. Since it is a small town, they may know who the person is. Is it okay to say up front that the names of the town were changed as well as the state? Absolutely. I think of, isn't there some popular TV show that we all watched, maybe Law and Order or something, where at the very beginning they say the names have been changed to protect the innocent or something. I think that's absolutely acceptable. I would encourage you, though, to not limit the color. I'm sure in a small town, I'm sure some of these experiences were very colorful, probably unique to those of us who didn't grow up in a small town. So I would encourage you to still try to capture the experiences and to still try to capture the nuances of each of these people with whom you were interacting. But absolutely, I think you can talk about, you can state upfront, caveat emptor, so to speak, that the names have been changed to protect yourself and or those whom you're writing about. All right, so we're going to move on to the writing process. This is my soapbox, so you'll bear with me. Writing is a generative process. You really have to sit down and you have to write. And it's something that takes practice and something that takes dedication. I always think about the anecdotes of authors who go away for a month to a cabin in the woods and are isolated so that they can commit themselves to sitting down and putting pen to paper or putting their fingers on the keyboard. So I think it's really important. We all know writing is hard. We know it's hard work. But it's something that will get easier the more you practice. So give yourself some tools to help that, to make that a little easier for you. Follow your outline. That outline, you did that work to give yourself a hand. So follow your outline, but again, give yourself room to experiment. We don't want you to be so rigidly committed to your outline that a spark of inspiration or a new idea doesn't have the room to fit within your writing process. So do refer back to it, but don't be too rigid. It's important at this stage, I'm assuming this is your first draft, to banish thoughts about grammatical and syntactical minutiae. No editor, no submissions editor is going to judge you because your grammar is not perfect or your punctuation is not perfect. Obviously, we want to see a capacity with the language, but we really are not, we don't have, frankly, the time to sit there and copy edit your manuscript as we're looking at it for submission. So at first draft stage, even second draft, even third draft, it's just not make or break. So don't get caught up thinking about grammar and syntax. That's why you're going to hire a copy editor, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And finally, just write. Sit down, whether it's maybe you get up early and your household hasn't woken up yet, and you put your headphones on and you sit there for an hour and you try to get a page done. Or maybe you're a late night person, or maybe you use your lunch hour at work to close your office door and just start working on your project. Find the time, dedicate the time, and do it. It's going to get easier as you practice. So here's some tips for the writing process. As I mentioned, get into a routine. You're going to need to dedicate yourself to writing. So make it as easy as possible for yourself. Do you have an office in your house where you can kind of set up your computer, have it ready for you when you can dedicate an hour? Are you a notebook person? Some people still put pencil on the page. Keep a notebook with you at all time and jot down your ideas. It's going to help you with your outline, and you may find yourself struck by inspiration and write a couple pages of prose. There's nothing wrong with that. So give yourself the tools, set yourself up for a routine. If you're working on a computer, save your work and back up often. It seems like a no-brainer, but I certainly have lost my work from not saving or not backing up, so it warrants saying. Save your work and back up often. Leave yourself notes about outside sources. If you're working in nonfiction and you are citing others or even referring to others, leave yourself a paper trail. I can't tell you how many times I've worked on a manuscript where we get to a later stage and we find that a footnote is incomplete and the author can't track down the source of that footnote material. So leave yourself a paper trail, make photocopies of the pages you use, where your quotes come from, or even photocopy the copyright pages of the books you might use as sources. It's really going to help you in the end. Beware of material that may require permission. We've talked a little bit about this with some of you who've asked questions about interviews. Other materials that require permissions are poems, song lyrics. We see song lyrics used all the time, and people don't consider that to republish that material, they might need a permissions form, and it might cost money to get permission to print that material. So be aware of what might require permission. You can do a simple Google search to maybe give you an idea: song titles, poems, long excerpts from other published materials, and photographs are some of those that we see commonly. So keep track of that information and be aware that you may have to pay to use that. Lay the foundation for visual elements if you're using illustrations. Are you using photographs? Are you using cartoons? Are you using graphs and charts? It'll be important that that material be submitted with your manuscript and that you know where it came from. Again, this is something that might require permission, if not attribution, to the person who created it. Make occasional message, audience, and differentiation checks. So check yourself. Go back to your outline. Go back to your 3 to 5 minute or 3 to 5 sentence elevator pitch. Are you still on message? It's important that you continue to have message, audience, and differentiation in mind as you get into your manuscript. Keep track of length. A good rule of thumb for probably a publishable manuscript is about 55,000 words. That accounts to approximately 150 printed pages. We do, in publishing, tend to talk about word count. So if you shoot for about 55,000 words, you're doing pretty well. Much longer, and you're getting into 200, 250 page books, maybe that's not an appropriate length for your genre. So do your research, keep an idea of what other books in your genre are in terms of page count and how you might fit there. And then finally, decide whether you'll share early content with anyone and consider the outcome. And we'll speak a little bit about that in further slides. Okay, I think we might have another question. Is it necessary to write acknowledgement page? I use so many sources it would be prohibitive, yet I feel guilty not doing so. So I guess I have a question here. Are you asking about an acknowledgement to those who may have helped you, or your husband, your wife, so on, or are you talking about works cited? It's not necessary to have an acknowledgement to your children, your husband, your wife, somebody who helped you publish your manuscript. That's absolutely not necessary. However, I would encourage you, if you are referring to other sources, you really should have a works cited page or some way to document your references, if not full footnotes. I know footnotes seem laborious, but they're very useful, especially in some genres. And they're not, if you get into a habit with them, or if you kind of develop a methodology for them, they are not necessarily too onerous to develop. So I would say you don't absolutely have to thank people for helping you with your project, but if you are using sources, I would encourage you to keep a list of that. And your editor can assess it critically to decide how we might use that in the book, and so on. So great question. I hope I was able to answer it. Follow up if not. Okay, what to do with your first draft? So congratulations, you finished your first draft. That's quite an accomplishment. You are going to want to seek feedback, and we encourage you to do that. We encourage strongly that you seek professional manuscript evaluation or evaluation of your manuscript from somebody who is sort of within the realm of publishing, who is a critical reader, somebody who's going to not look at your project through rose-colored glasses. So you might send your manuscript to a publishing house like Greenleaf, where we do diagnoses, and we're happy to tell you sort of what we think about your project and what we might do to support its publication. Or you might send a proposal to a publishing house. They're not going to give you really a manuscript evaluation, but you're going to get some kind of feedback one way or another. So I would encourage you to talk to a publisher who can offer you an evaluation, a writing group, maybe a peer who has some professional experience with your genre. Maybe you're writing in the leadership genre and you are in a group of leadership peers like a Vistage type group. Maybe someone in that group can give you some critical feedback on your manuscript. And of course you're going to want to share your manuscript with family, friends, and or colleagues. It can be very helpful, but it also might not be that helpful. So here again, you want to look for critical readers in your circle who can read your draft from the perspective of a potential book buyer. A family member or a friend who may offer feedback might not be in your target market demographic. So try to think of it that way when you're sharing your manuscript with family members or friends. If they're not in your target market or demographic, Their feedback may encourage revisions that are not optimal for you. So you should also be critical about, and I mean a critical thinker, about the type of feedback you receive on your project. Is that person hitting the mark of what you're after? Or are they saying, I just don't understand what you're writing about, this is not helpful to me? So be thoughtful in who you ask to read your manuscript. And your mother, while she may be a wonderful supporter of your work, may not have the most constructive feedback. So take it with a grain of salt. And we're going to talk a little bit now about the path to publication. I mentioned a publisher like Greenleaf, where we offer services like manuscript diagnosis. We are an independent / hybrid type publisher. We're a combination of the traditional house and a self-publishing service. We review our manuscripts critically. We have professional editors in-house, professional marketing staff, professional platform providers, as well as professional book designers. So we sort of straddle the line between the traditional house, wherein you sign over your rights, your copyright. We don't take copyright of the project, so that's the way in which we're more like a self-publishing venue. A traditional house, you're probably not going to send them your full draft. They most likely don't have time to read it. You're going to send them a proposal. I would check the website and decide and define what they're looking for in terms of a manuscript proposal. I read a great one today. It was 3-4 pages long, very clear in terms of each part of the book and how each part would build on the preceding part. The author's goals and the author's platform were all explained to me in the proposal. It was excellent. That would be the type of proposal that a traditional house is looking for. They're going to want to read your message, your audience, your differentiation. They want to know if you have a platform. Is there some type of reputation they can leverage to market your project? We're going to also want that. And then I would also encourage you to research agents if you're looking for a traditional house. And we have a question about genre I'll get to in just 1 second. So I've described to you a little bit of what an independent or hybrid house does, like Greenleaf. They can vary. While we are happy to take a proposal or a draft, some might not. So you may want to use a proposal in working with an independent or hybrid publishing house, or you may want to send your first draft. Either is probably fine. And then in self-publishing, wherein you might be doing all of the legwork yourself, I do think it's really important that you give your book the editorial and design support it deserves. So you can probably find a freelance editor out there who can work on your project, and hopefully a graphic designer or a book designer who might be able to support you in packaging, literally packaging your project. It will be important if you're looking at self-publishing to evaluate the different types of self-publishers and decide who's offering what you think your book needs. So we have a question. I'm going to take a question here about the genres that Greenleaf publishes in. We don't really limit ourselves in terms of genre. We have a robust fiction list. We really became well known publishing in nonfiction, leadership, business type books, but we've expanded greatly. We have a robust self-help list. We've also branched out into coffee table, novelty type projects, heavily illustrated. We also have recently been doing a number of cookbooks. So that's kind of a sampling of the breadth of genres Greenleaf publishes in. I would say generally we do not discriminate, and we love to see all kinds of projects come through our submission door. So thank you for that question. Hopefully you'll send us your project. I think we're getting near the end, so I just want to reiterate, tweet to win a submission evaluation at Greenleaf Book GR, #IdeasThrive. You can also chat us up in the dialog box, and I thank you all for your wonderful questions. They've been terrific. So we're going to move into book editing and really what it entails and what it means. What does an editor do? Editors vary, or I should say the scope of what an editor does varies from publishing house to publishing house. But what does an editor do, and why do I need one? In this case, in terms of somebody who's actually going to get into the language of your project, I would say the editor does not inject personal agenda or aspirations into your manuscript. I can speak for myself and say, as an editor, it is not my intention to make my voice your voice. In fact, it is my intention to enhance your voice and make sure your voice speaks most loudly. I am a supporting character in the cast of your book publishing. An editor serves as a test reader and a reader's advocate. So when I'm working in a project, I'm really looking from the perspective of the person who's going to pick up your book in the bookstore. Would I want to read your book from start to finish if I picked it up? And how best can our collaboration, that is the editor's and the author's collaboration, serve the reader's goal of getting through your book from start to finish? Your editor identifies holes in your story and or the author's blind spots. So this is probably most true for fiction and or a memoir-ish type genre. You know, where might there be places that the reader isn't necessarily on the same page with you? Where have you lost their attention, or maybe not filled in sufficient background for them to continue to move through your story? Your editor delivers impartial advice and strategies for improving problems. Like I said, we are collaborating with you, so I want to give you the best advice that's going to give your project the best chance, and I want to work with you to come up with strategies for fixing any problems that we identify in your manuscript. And finally, as I have mentioned, the editor works collaboratively, not unilaterally. Most editors are introverts who do not have agendas of fame and fortune and, you know, having their name on the front cover of your book. So we really very much want to support you, and we will not make unilateral decisions. And then important notes about working with an editor. Trust your editor, but don't be afraid to inquire about his or her thinking. You should always ask, why did you change that paragraph structure? If you don't necessarily read it and agree with it, ask. Your editor will be more than happy to talk you through their thought process. And then finally, remember, the editor is not judging you. We don't care if your grammar is perfect. We don't care if your syntax is magical. We want to make it that for you. So we're not judging you. We're there to help you. Now, what types of editorial support can you expect? So we're going to start kind of from the most significant and then move to the maybe most, I don't know, superficial would be the word, or maybe not superficial, maybe working more in grammar and punctuation and that sort of thing. So first we'll start with the ghostwriter. What is a ghostwriter, and why might you need a ghostwriter? The ghostwriter channels the author's voice and expertise, but really picks up the slack where an expert, celebrity, or frankly just very busy person may not have the time or skill set to write a book. There's no shame in employing a ghostwriter. In fact, if you can take advantage of that service, I say go for it. The ghostwriter must get to know you as the author and must become an expert in your topic as much as possible. But that person, much like an editor, will not make unilateral decisions. They depend on your frequent input and collaboration. A ghostwriter, like an editor, is a partner in your book process. The ghostwriter is ideal for a busy entrepreneur, a CEO, or an executive who maybe has a company to run, a speaking platform, and wants to write a book but just can't find the time to put pen to paper. Use a ghostwriter. That's a great tool for you. And finally, using a ghostwriter does not diminish your accomplishment in authoring a book. In fact, it might help you achieve that goal. If you really want to get a book out there and you just can't make the time, A ghostwriter absolutely should be at the top of your list. And a book publisher can help you identify and interview ghostwriters. So look to your publisher and or your agent to help you find that ghostwriter who's right for you. The writing coach or the project development editor. That editor assists you during the writing process. They really are your cheerleader. They're going to talk you through message, audience, and differentiation. So if you have those three things already set out, that writing coach or project development editor is always going to ask you, how does this fit your message? Who is your audience? Are you still meeting the audience's needs? And are you adhering to your market differentiation ideas? So that person's really going to kind of keep you on task. They will help you build an outline. They will give you feedback on early writing. And they will also keep you on track and encourage you. Look to that person as your best support network at the stage of writing your first draft. And finally, the writing coach reviews the work as you complete it and will offer course correction as needed. Is there a big leap between Chapter 4 and Chapter 5? Maybe you haven't done a sufficient job of linking those two together. Or maybe there's a big concept that you thought your reader would pick up from your prose and your project development editor didn't pick it up. They're going to help you identify that spot and help you course correct. Great. The developmental editor. The developmental editor jumps into your manuscript ready to restructure and maybe even rewrite short sections. That person may rearrange chapters and sections, trim repetitive content. That's often a blind spot for writers. It's very hard when you're 100 pages into your manuscript to remember that you may have already told that story before, or maybe you've already explained that concept. Your developmental editor is going to be able to identify that, identify patterns of repetition, and trim where needed. The developmental editor will also prompt you to elaborate where there might be new content needed. They will help you ensure focused message and audience. So this is a continuation, as you can see, of your writing coach. They can also work in the grammar and syntax. They can do some high-level polishing. A developmental editor really can kind of do just about anything. And like a ghostwriter, needing a developmental editor does not mean you're a bad writer. Sometimes we can really become myopic when we're writing our projects. So this person takes a step away, really looks at it from a different angle, really advocates for the reader and says, hey, this is how we can better serve your demographic or your market. Here's a sample of what developmental editing might look like if you're an author with Greenleaf, for example. This is a sample of sort of the level of work a developmental editor might do in your manuscript. You can see we use track changes. Track changes is really the tool of our trade, and I would encourage any of you out there writing a manuscript and hoping to publish to become as comfortable with track changes as you can. It will really serve you as you work through the publishing process. But here what you can see is we've offered some comments, we've rearranged the order of some information, and we've rewritten some information. So this is a snapshot of developmental editing. Moving on to the line or the substantive editor. This person works on prose and syntax. Make sure your ideas flow logically, working on transitions especially. Here it can be useful for the line or substantive editor to have an idea of your outline and to do a cross-check and make sure you have kind of followed that outline that you think really captures the order of information in your project. The line editor also clarifies confusing or ambiguous passages, ensures style and voice are grammatically consistent. I think you can probably all see how each one of these editorial services or editorial identities build on the other, and there may be overlaps between them. Many of us editors do it all. I, for one, if I'm working on a developmental edit, can't ignore prose and syntax. It's just kind of impossible for me. So I might be incorporating some of these line edit efforts into my developmental edit. And all the better for you. Here's an example of some substantive editing. Again, you can see we've used track changes. There's less red on this page. There are still some comments. Actually, I don't think there are comments, just deleted text. In the bubbles in the margin, some prose has been moved. There's probably been some new prose inserted here, as well as some grammar and punctuation modified. And the copy editor. This is what most people think of when they think of an editor, but this person really is getting into the minutia of grammar and punctuation. So as we've seen, there are different levels of editorial services, and maybe not everyone is a copy editor who is a developmental editor. So the copy editor addresses the nitty-gritty of grammar and punctuation. That person ensures correct and consistent spelling and technical style. Here at Greenleaf, we use the Chicago Manual of Style and the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as our two style guides. So some others might use an APA style. There are other styles that are employed depending on genre and or publishing house. But what that copy editor is doing is ensuring that what Chicago says is the correct way to use a comma, you have used that comma. Or the correct way to format a footnote, we're following the Chicago Manual of Style. At the copy editing stage, along with the next stage, which is proofreading, the edits may seem nitpicky, but they're really important, and they do really set your work apart as a professionally published project. And here's an example of what a copy edited page might look like. There are some, you can have to look probably pretty closely there to see some changed capitalization, some deleted words, maybe some changed punctuation as well. And we'll pause here for a question. I have a first draft ready to go, but I know I need to make some changes. Should I contact an editor knowing it needs work, or get it as perfect as I can at first? Well, I'm curious to know what types of changes this manuscript needs. Does it need polishing, or are there holes in your message? Are there holes in your trajectory from start, middle to end? I would encourage that your draft be as polished as possible in terms of capturing your message, capturing your voice, and conveying your point or your story. If you're thinking it needs to be edited in terms of copy editing, or maybe even in terms of sub-editing, I wouldn't necessarily jump at the chance of hiring an editor, probably because I'm going to assume you're looking to have the book published at a house like Greenleaf, or maybe a traditional house where there are editors who can do that work for you. So, all right, and finally, moving on to the proofreader. I love that Greenleaf, for example, employs proofreaders. I think this is a skill that is so critical to a finished, final, polished project. The proofreader serves as the final defense against errors of all kinds: grammar, punctuation, orphans, widows, all kinds of typographic details that the editor, your copy editor, your sub-editor, may not see when the book is still in a Word document. So that proofreader is really doing close reading to make sure your grammar and punctuation are as perfect as possible. And all editors are human, so your copy editor may have missed a capitalization after a colon, or a quotation mark inside a semicolon. That proofreader is really going to support your copy editor and make sure all of those are perfect. They also make sure the designer who's entering any post-production changes entered those changes correctly. Again, designers are human. They may mistype something. So that proofreader really is our last line of defense. Some issues that proofreaders catch are widows and orphans, word divisions, typeface consistencies, running heads and foots, folio placement, stacks of hyphens, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on, and I would encourage you to always have a proofreader working on your project. Here's an example of some proofreading marks. You can see they work in pen because they're looking at post-production manuscripts typically, and your designer is going to take these notes and implement them and ensure that your project is as clean as possible. So, thank you all so much. I know that was really an immense amount of information. I appreciate your attention and your questions. Again, we encourage you to tweet us at Greenleaf Book GR. Our website is here on this last slide. And I think we're going to close out the questions. Yeah. Thank you all so much, and please keep an eye out for our next webinars.